The morning was August 31st, 1955, when a fisherman named Robert Hodges saw something caught against the roots of a cottonwood tree along the Tallahatchie River. At first, he thought it was a drowned animal, swollen, pale, and motionless beneath the film of brown water. But when he drew closer, the air shifted. The thing had limbs, a head, a shape that was once a boy. The current lapped against the body as though it was still whispering secrets to him, unwilling to let go. They pulled him out with a rope, the stench of decay clinging to the air like a sermon left too long unspoken. His face was beaten beyond recognition. One eye hung loose, his skull split by a pistol's weight, a fan blade wired around his neck. In his pocket, a silver ring engraved with initials that would soon change the nation. Ellie. The sheriff on scene called it a Negro boy. No name, no urgency. Just another river casualty in a town where justice was currency and black life cheap. But in Chicago, a mother named Mamie would soon learn that her 14-year-old son, sent down south for a quiet summer, had come home as evidence. The river that morning didn't just give up a body. It gave up a lie America had been drowning for centuries. And as the coroner's men wrapped the boy in a tarp, one of them muttered, "Best not let the press see this." But someone already would. Someone who would insist the world see every inch. The camera was waiting. The mother was waiting. The reckoning was waiting, swelling beneath the Mississippi heat, ready to crawl from the water and scream.
3 days before the river found him, the boy had boarded the Illinois Central train with a grin that made strangers smile back. Emmett Till was 14, restless, talkative, proud of his new hat, and loud enough that his mother warned him to be careful down south. Chicago was loud too, but it was a safe kind of loud. Mississippi was a different sound altogether. Cicadas, screen doors, and the kind of silence that listened before it struck. Mamie Till packed his suitcase herself. 1 pair of overalls, 2 shirts, a tie, and that ring with his father's initials, LT, for Louis Till, the man the army had executed a decade earlier in Italy. She pressed her son's face between her palms and said, "Be polite, Emmett. You do as they say." He laughed it off. 14-year-olds always think the world bends to charm. The train whistle wailed through the night as Chicago's skyline bled into the cornfields. He shared candy with cousins, made jokes, told stories about his new bike and the jukebox at the corner diner. By morning, the air grew thicker, heavier. The South had a smell, wet earth and old wood, and a memory that never forgot color. When they reached Money, Mississippi, Emmett's cousin Wheeler Parker would later say the boy looked out at the cotton fields and said, "Man, people still pick this stuff." It was the kind of innocence that could only exist north of the Mason-Dixon line. No one on that train knew that in less than a week, that same boy's body would ride back home inside a coffin sealed with nails and history. But that day, as the train hissed to a stop, the conductor tipped his hat. And the world still felt safe. Bryant's grocery and meat market stood at a bend in the road like a relic no one dared repaint. Peeling white boards, a porch sagging under years of dust and gossip. It was the kind of store where cotton pickers bought soda on credit and white men leaned against the wall to watch who walked in. On August 24, 1955, Emmett Till walked in with his cousins, a whistle on his lips and change clinking in his pocket. They wanted bubble gum. They wanted to cool off from the heat. Inside was Carolyn Bryant, 21, pale, with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to wield attention like a weapon. Emmett handed her money and, by some accounts, said, "Bye, baby." Others swore he whistled. In Mississippi, 1955, there was no difference between sound and sin. The cousins froze. The white men outside looked up. Carolyn stiffened. It lasted seconds. But seconds are enough to rearrange history. When Emmett left, his cousins grabbed him by the arm and hissed, "Boy, you done signed your death warrant." Emmett laughed it off, oblivious, unaware that in towns like Money, every glance was recorded, every gesture filed as evidence of defiance. Carolyn would later tell her husband Roy that a Negro boy had made advances on her, grabbed her hand, whistled, depending on which version she wanted to believe that day. The lie traveled fast. It didn't just move through the town, it rooted there. By nightfall, 2 white men would already be loading a pistol into a truck. In that store, beneath the single buzzing bulb, a whistle had become an indictment. A harmless sound that would echo across decades, louder than any scream.
It was just after 2 in the morning when headlights cut through the cotton fields and slowed before the Wright's cabin. The dogs barked first, then the gravel crunched under boots. Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, half drunk, half righteous, stood at the door with flashlights and guns, their voices thick with something uglier than rage. "Where's the boy from Chicago?" they demanded. Inside, Emmett was asleep on a cot, the night air still heavy from the day's heat. His cousins tried to hide him, but the light found him. Millam yanked open the door. "Get your clothes on," he barked. "We want to talk to you." The boy pulled on his pants, slipped into his shoes. He tried to smile, as if politeness could save him. Mamie's warnings must have flickered in his mind. Don't look them in the eye. Don't talk back. Yes, sir. No, sir. But nothing she'd said could prepare him for men who'd already decided what justice looked like. They dragged him out into the dark, threw him in the back of a pickup. His great-uncle, Moses Wright, followed barefoot, pleading. "He's only 14, he said, his voice trembling. Millam turned, eyes like wet stone. "If he's 14, he's old enough to learn." The truck drove off into the Mississippi night, tail lights shrinking into the distance until they disappeared entirely. The crickets went quiet. The house fell still. No one inside spoke. The South had claimed another child, and this time it would not stay silent. The fields held their breath, and the river, miles away, waited for its offering.
They drove for miles through cotton and swamp until the gravel turned to dirt and the dirt to mud. Somewhere near Drew, Mississippi, stood an old barn on Millam's property, a structure that smelled of rust, manure, and rot. The men pulled Emmett from the truck bed and led him inside, their flashlights slicing through the dark like thin, cruel blades. There was no trial here, no jury, no defense. Just wood beams, chains, and the sound of insects beating against the tin roof. What happened next was never written down in one voice, only in fragments, like pieces of a dream no one wanted to remember. A pistol's butt struck first. Then fists. Then the fan blade from a cotton gin, brought as proof of purpose. They demanded he call them sir. They demanded apology, confession, submission. But witnesses later said he never begged. He didn't cry. Even broken and bleeding, he looked at them the way his father once looked at military judges overseas. Steady, silent, knowing that dignity sometimes costs more than life. When the gun fired, it wasn't loud enough to echo across the fields. Just a flat pop swallowed by night. The men dragged the body to the truck, tied the gin fan around his neck with barbed wire, and drove to the river. One of them lit a cigarette as they worked, the smoke curling through the air like a benediction. "That'll teach him," someone muttered. The Tallahatchie accepted its burden quietly, as if it had done this before. The water closed in slow circles, hiding the evidence beneath its own reflection. For 3 days, the Tallahatchie kept its silence. Fishermen passed by, the sun rose and fell, and the river carried its secret under the hush of dragonflies and the hum of heat. But water, like truth, has limits to what it can hold. On the morning of August 31st, it surrendered the boy to daylight. The body snagged against a log, bloated and pale, the fan blade still wired to his neck. His face was gone, but his name would not be. The sheriff arrived and muttered, "We'll bury him quick." But nothing about Emmett Till's story would stay buried. The local undertaker, horrified, telephoned Chicago. The telegram to Mamie Till was short, factual, merciless. "Body found in river. Possibly your son." That night, she sat by the phone, gripping the edge of the table as if it might steady the world. When confirmation came, she didn't scream. She simply said, "Send him home." The Mississippi officials wanted the coffin sealed, wanted the world to never see what had been done. But Mamie refused. "No," she said, her voice flat, precise, final. "Let them see what I've seen." The train carried him north in a wooden box that smelled of pine and iron, watched over by men who couldn't meet each other's eyes. In Chicago, thousands would soon line the streets to witness the truth, but for now, the river ran quiet again, washing the blood from its banks. It had done its part. The rest belonged to the living, the ones who had to look.
When the coffin arrived at Chicago's Illinois Central Station, it drew silence from the crowd. Reporters, porters, and mothers with their children stood still as the wooden box was lifted down. The lid was nailed shut, stamped with the words, "Do not open." But Mamie Till's will was a force greater than any official order. "Open it," she said. The undertaker hesitated. She repeated it. "Let me see my boy." The hammer's first strike cracked more than the lid. It split the illusion that cruelty could stay hidden. Inside lay what was left of her son, his face unrecognizable, swollen, mutilated beyond human shape. One eye gone, the other clouded, his tongue torn, his skull caved. The ring on his finger, engraved LT, was the only proof of who he was. Mamie didn't flinch. She wept without sound, then straightened her back. "Leave it open," she told the funeral director. "Let the world see what they did." For 5 days, more than 50,000 people passed through Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ, filing past the coffin in quiet horror. Mothers fainted. Fathers wept. Reporters took photographs. The flash of the camera turned grief into witness, light against rot. When Jet magazine printed the images, America could no longer pretend it didn't know. A boy's body became a national indictment, a mirror held to a country that preferred to look away. The air inside the church was heavy with perfume and formaldehyde, yet beneath it all, there was something electric, unstoppable, the stir of a movement not yet named but already awake.
The images spread faster than any sermon, faster than any denial. Jet magazine printed them in stark monochrome. No warning, no apology, just the truth under bright, merciless light. A mother beside an open coffin. A boy whose face no longer resembled boyhood. In barbershops, church basements, and Harlem apartments, people gathered around the glossy pages, speechless. In Mississippi, white men folded their newspapers in anger, muttering about agitators. But in Chicago and New York, something had shifted. The photographs turned private grief into public reckoning. Reporters who'd ignored Southern lynchings for decades suddenly descended on money, Mississippi, notebooks trembling in their hands. Black newspapers called Emmett, the boy who made America look. The Chicago Defender printed, "This is the face of democracy's disease." Meanwhile, Mamie Till spoke softly into microphones, her voice controlled, unwavering. "I wanted the world to see what they did to my baby," she said. That sentence, simple, maternal, devastating, cut deeper than any manifesto. Pastors preached it, activists memorized it, and the country could no longer wash its hands of the river. Across the South, sheriffs and politicians scrambled to contain the story. The killers were known, the evidence clear, yet local lawmen promised a fair trial as if fairness had ever lived in those courtrooms. By mid-September, the murderers had been arrested and released on bail, laughing with reporters, cigars between their teeth. Outside the courthouse, the heat rose, flies swarmed, and the ghost of a boy waited for the gavel to fall, knowing it never would. September 19th, 1955. The courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, filled with sweat, tobacco, and expectation. Ceiling fans turned lazily above the crowd, stirring heat rather than relief. White men in pressed shirts lined the front rows, their wives fanning themselves behind them like pale ghosts. Outside, the square pulsed with journalists and curious townsfolk, all drawn by the spectacle of what they already knew would not be justice but performance. Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam sat at the defense table, smirking, their lawyers cracking jokes with the jury. 12 white men, farmers all, nodding like old friends. The prosecution's case was simple. They'd kidnapped, tortured, and killed a 14-year-old boy. The defense's was simpler. It wasn't him, and even if it was, the boy had broken the code. Reporters described the smell of coffee, sweat, and pine floor wax mingling with the buzz of small talk as the proceedings began. When Moses Wright took the stand, the room fell still. He pointed a trembling finger across the courtroom and said, "There he is." It was the first time a black man in Mississippi had ever accused a white man publicly in open court. The gesture felt seismic, sacrilegious, revolutionary. Some whispered he'd signed his own death warrant. The defense scoffed. The jurors avoided his eyes. Carolyn Bryant, veiled in pearls and pity, testified next, her story changing, twisting, shrinking into practiced innocence. Each lie settled into the jury box like dust. The air was thick, slow, heavy with what everyone already knew. Truth had entered the room, but it wasn't invited to stay. It took the jury 67 minutes to decide. Later, one juror would admit they'd only taken that long because they'd stopped for soda. When the foreman stood and read "not guilty," there was laughter in the room, soft, relieved, familiar laughter. Bryant and Millham grinned, patted each other's backs, and kissed their wives as though they'd returned from war heroes. Reporters scribbled. Photographers flashed. The judge's gavel struck wood, but it sounded more like applause than order. Outside, in the heat, a crowd of white townsfolk celebrated, shaking hands, slapping shoulders, shouting, "That's Mississippi justice." Inside, Moses Wright bowed his head, and the sound of his breath was louder than the gavel itself. The trial was over, but the lie it upheld stretched across every county line in America. Mamie Till heard the verdict on the radio. She didn't cry. "I expected it," she said. "But God's not done yet." A week later, Look magazine would publish Bryant and Millham's full confession. Not whispered, not leaked, but sold for money. They bragged about the killing, about teaching the boy a lesson. The article called it "the shocking story of a proved murder in Mississippi." The words burned through the nation like scripture rewritten in gasoline. There was no appeal, no sentence, no justice. Just a body, a mother, and a country pretending not to stare. But something had cracked. In that fracture, the first light of the civil rights movement began to flicker, faint, uncertain, but impossible to put out. When Look magazine hit the stands in January 1956, the cover was bright, harmless, domestic ads, smiling faces, the usual distractions. But buried inside was a story that smelled of river water and rot. The headline read, "The shocking story of a proved murder in Mississippi." The article ran nearly 5,000 words, written like a confession without shame. Bryant and Millham told the reporter, William Bradford Huey, everything. How they'd taken Emmett from his uncle's home, how they'd just wanted to scare him, and how that lesson turned into execution. They described it with the cold precision of men recounting a hunt. Huey had paid them $4,000 for the exclusive. They could speak freely now, protected by double jeopardy. "We weren't after killing the nigger," Millham said. "We just wanted to teach him how to act." America read that line over breakfast, coffee steaming, bacon crisping, eyes widening as truth stepped out of the shadows. Letters poured into the magazine's office, outrage, horror, some even admiration from those who believed the South had stood its ground. The editors printed them all. The article spread like contagion, infecting every parlor, every barbershop, every bus stop conversation. And through it, the lie of justice served dissolved completely. The killers had spoken, the law had bowed, and the world could no longer claim ignorance. Yet down in Mississippi, they still walked free, still smiled in photographs, still fished the same river that had carried the boy's body. For the first time, America was looking, and the South, unmasked, didn't blink.
Mamie Till was supposed to bury her son and fade into history, the way most mothers of murdered children were expected to, quiet, compliant, consumed by grief. But grief, in her, became something else. It became structure. It became speech. Within weeks of the trial, she was traveling across the country, her black dress pressed, her voice unwavering. Churches filled with people who came to hear not sermons, but testimony. "I saw what hate can do," she would say. "Now let me show you what love can fight." She carried photographs of her boy, not the smiling one in his Chicago Sunday suit, but the open casket one, the truth in its rawest, ugliest form. Every time she held it up, the room changed temperature. People shifted, some gasped, some turned away, but no one left. She refused to let the world forget. The NAACP sent her on a national speaking tour. Reporters followed, jotting down her words, trying to capture the calm fury in her tone. "I am not the first mother who has suffered this," she said once, "but I mean to be the last." She met Rosa Parks that winter. Weeks later, when Parks refused to give up her bus seat, she told friends she'd been thinking of Emmett Till. Mamie's grief had rippled outward, from pulpits to protest lines, from mourning to movement. The South might have silenced a boy, but his mother had found her voice. And her voice was contagious.
Winter came early that year, but the air itself seemed charged, restless, alive. Across the South, whispers turned into meetings, and meetings turned into plans. The Montgomery Improvement Association had been gathering for months, but now their purpose sharpened. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on December 1, 1955, she later said she was thinking of a boy from Chicago, the one whose photo had stared out from every newspaper, whose mother had refused to look away. "I thought of Emmett Till," she said quietly, "and I just couldn't move." The movement that would reshape America began, in part, with that still image of a mutilated child, an image so unbearable that it forced even silence to act. Students at Southern universities began printing his name on leaflets, slipping them under dorm doors and into church bulletins. Preachers invoked him from their pulpits, calling him a martyr of modern faith. In Harlem, jazz musicians played tributes. In Mississippi, field workers sang his name in low hymns as they picked cotton under the same sun that had seen him die. Every town meeting, every leaflet, every march drew its first breath from the same dark river. The horror that had been meant as a warning had become a call to arms. And through it all, Mamie Till watched quietly from the north, proud, broken, and certain that her son's death had not been in vain. The South had hoped to erase a boy. Instead, it had given birth to a movement. While the movement stirred and history began to tilt, down in Mississippi the murderers slept easy. Roy Bryant reopened his grocery store, its front porch again filled with laughter and tobacco smoke. J.W. Millam went back to farming, sunburnt and smug, bragging in bars that the boy had it coming. They posed for photos with friends, their wives serving lemonade to guests who still called them good men. Local papers stopped mentioning the case, and in Sumner, people said it was time to move on. But time is not merciful. The town aged, business slowed, and the Bryant store fell quiet, dust gathering where shouts once echoed. Men who'd cheered the verdict began to die off one by one, their names written small in obituary columns. The gin fan rusted in the river mud. Children grew up hearing the whispers, "Don't talk about that summer. Don't go stirring ghosts." Yet ghosts never needed help to rise. When reporters returned decades later, they found old men who remembered the trial as a carnival, the laughter, the camera flashes. "We thought it'd blow over," one said. "Didn't figure folks would still be talking about it." But they were. In Chicago, in classrooms, in streets where protest chants echoed the same rhythm as the train that once carried a boy south. In the end, Bryant and Millam never faced another jury, never lost a night's sleep. But the South around them began to change, inch by inch, as if the land itself was restless, waiting to atone.
Something had shifted beneath the nation's skin, a tremor, faint but spreading. Northern newspapers that once treated Southern violence as distant weather now printed it on their front pages. College students debated the case in lecture halls. Preachers folded the boy's name into their prayers. Even those who wished to forget found his face waiting in print, on pulpits, in their children's schoolbooks. The country could no longer look away without seeing its reflection looking back. In Mississippi, the whitewashed silence began to crack. Reporters from Europe arrived, appalled that the land of the free could look so medieval. Politicians squirmed. Activists organized. The photographs refused to fade, and the name Emmett Till became a test, spoken softly, then louder, then shouted in streets where batons met skin and tear gas burned the air. Through it all, Mamie stood at rallies, composed but unyielding, repeating the same quiet truth. "My boy is the reason I stand." Her voice carried across microphones and hearts, small but seismic. You watching now, you know that tremor. The moment when truth unsettles comfort, when silence feels complicit. That's how history begins again. The question is never what happened then, but what will we do now? For some, that question turned to marches. For others, to music, to movement, to defiance. But it always began the same way, with the sound of a mother refusing to be quiet.
By 1956, Emmett Till's name had become more than memory, it was invocation. Children in Alabama whispered it at night the way their grandparents once whispered prayers. Marchers carried it on cardboard signs, the letters drawn unevenly by hand, trembling but legible. The name had rhythm, sorrow, and pulse. Preachers turned it into refrain, choirs sang it between verses of We Shall Overcome. Yet even as the movement rose, the country remained split between awakening and denial. Politicians up north called it a regional tragedy, hoping distance could absolve them. Southern sheriffs muttered about outside agitators, as though justice were foreign import. But the name endured, multiplying across radio waves, film reels, pamphlets, and picket lines. In classrooms, teachers who dared speak it found themselves reprimanded. In churches, pastors who ignored it found their pews empty. The name haunted America's conscience the way a single note haunts a song long after the last chord fades. In it was everything the nation wanted to bury: guilt, fear, memory. But history doesn't stay buried. It murmurs beneath the soil until someone listens. And everywhere now, someone was listening. Mothers began watching their sons with a different kind of fear, not of mischief, but of survival. Fathers began locking eyes with their boys, saying quietly, "Keep your head down." And yet, in the same breath, pride rose, a stubborn, unkillable pride born from tragedy, whispering that silence would never again be obedience. Decades later, long after the headlines had yellowed and the men who killed him were buried in unmarked soil, investigators began to retrace the old roads. Young reporters, armed with cameras instead of revolvers, arrived in Money, Mississippi, hunting ghosts. They found the store boarded up, its paint eaten by decades of humidity, its sign half-rotted, the word grocery barely legible. Locals were reluctant, their eyes darting away when the name Emmett Till surfaced. "Ain't no good talking about that," one man said, sweeping his porch. But silence had become evidence too. FBI agents reopened the case in 2004, armed with DNA tests, subpoena power, and history's weight. They exhumed the boy's body, confirmed his identity, and traced the old interviews line by line. Witnesses, now elderly, recalled voices, screams, headlights, the sound of a pickup door slamming shut. One woman said, "I still hear it when I close my eyes." Even Carolyn Bryant, then in her 70s, was questioned again. In a rare interview, she confessed that parts of her testimony were untrue, words that once ignited a killing now flickered with guilt. "Nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened," she said softly. For a moment, the country held its breath. But no new charges came. The law said time had passed too far, evidence too thin. Yet something had changed nonetheless. The past, once submerged, had surfaced again. The river had given up another secret, and this time, it was listening. When Carolyn Bryant Donham's frail voice resurfaced in history's echo chamber, the world leaned closer, not out of forgiveness, but curiosity. She was 82, living quietly in North Carolina, when a historian discovered her unpublished memoir. Inside, she admitted what so many had always known, that she had lied. The boy had not grabbed her, had not threatened her, had not done anything that warranted death. "He didn't deserve what happened to him," she wrote. The words were small, almost whispered, like a confession offered to an empty church. But they came 67 years too late. Her lie had already built a coffin, fueled a movement, and defined a century. When the pages leaked online, outrage rippled across generations. Activists marched again, calling for prosecution, though the killers were long dead. To some, her confession was proof of guilt, to others, just another insult, repentance without cost. The face that once hid behind a veil now appeared in headlines beside the boy she condemned, her name forever tied to his. She never faced trial,
never saw prison, never stood before the mothers who'd buried sons in similar soil. And yet, her words mattered, not because they healed, but because they revealed the rot that polite history tried to perfume. "I didn't want it to happen," she'd said, "but I couldn't stop it." The sentence carried every cowardice of a country that had once looked away and called it order. She died soon after, and some said the earth was lighter for it. But the echo of her lie still lingered in the air, restless and unresolved.
When the filmmakers, historians, and civil rights pilgrims began returning to Money, Mississippi, they found a town half asleep, half guilty. The old Bryant's grocery stood like a mausoleum, its boards warped, its windows shattered, vines climbing through what was left of the doorway. Locals passed it daily without looking, as if eye contact could summon the dead. "Ain't nothing here but ghosts," one man muttered when asked. And he was right. The ghosts were in the dust, the cracked pavement, the water that still ran slow behind the fields. A memorial plaque had been raised near the river, marking the place where Emmett's body was found, but within months it was shot full of bullet holes. Again and again, new plaques replaced it, each one punctured by fresh gunfire until historians replaced it with bulletproof steel. The gesture was more than symbolic, it was proof that the past was still alive, still contested, still dangerous to remember. When the filmmakers recorded the sound of the river, they said it still murmured softly, like breath caught in a throat. They filmed the barn, the roads, the courthouse, each one quieter than memory, louder than denial. In the town diner, a woman served coffee and said, "People come here looking for him, but he ain't here no more." Maybe not. But his story was. It clung to the walls, to the air, to the soil itself. Money had become a kind of shrine, one that denied its holiness but could never erase its sin. Memory in America has gravity, it drags the living back to the scene, forces the eyes open, makes the heart remember what the law tried to forget. For Mamie Till, that weight never lifted. She lived until 2003, long enough to see textbooks, films, and generations of children speak her son's name like a prayer. But even in her later years, when reporters asked if she'd forgiven, her answer never changed: "I can't forgive something that hasn't stopped happening." She understood what most historians missed, that Emmett's death wasn't a closed story. It was a lens, a recurring pattern, a mirror still fogged with breath. The 1960s burned with protests his murder had sparked. The 1970s tried to legislate healing. The 1980s buried outrage under nostalgia. But in every decade, when another black child was killed and another courtroom excused it, the river stirred again. Teachers hung his photo in classrooms, activists marched with his name on their banners, and musicians, Billie Holiday to Kendrick Lamar, sang him into immortality. To remember him was to admit complicity. To forget him was to join the crime. And so, the country carried the memory like a scar, visible, tender, occasionally mistaken for healing. History books softened the words, calling it racial violence. But that phrase, like all euphemisms, was a fence around a wound. The truth remained: America had murdered a child and tried to bury him twice, once in water, once in silence. Only one of those burials failed.
The Tallahatchie still moves, slow and deliberate, as if time itself thickens when it reaches that bend where the cottonwood roots once held the boy. Locals say the water runs colder there, even in summer. They say at dusk, when the light goes copper and the insects quiet, you can almost hear a hum beneath the current. Not a ghost, not a voice, but something older than both. The river remembers. It doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, just carries. In 2018, a group of students from Ole Miss visited the spot, laying flowers and reading aloud from the court transcripts. Behind them, distant laughter from a pickup truck drifted across the field. Someone fired a gun in the air, mocking, meaningless, but the echo lingered. That's what the South does with history. It argues with it out loud. Yet even those trying to erase him have failed, because the river won't comply. The Tallahatchie has seen too much. It carries fragments of the rope, the scent of gin, the rust of machinery meant to sink truth. It also carries every flower left since, every tear, every apology that came too late. And somewhere in that endless motion, The boy who was meant to disappear has become something unerasable. People come now and speak his name softly into the air, half prayer, half promise, as dragonflies skim the surface. The water folds over each syllable and moves on, patient as grief, certain as justice that never sleeps.
They called themselves many things: advocates, witnesses, survivors. But beneath every title was one word that bound them: mother. Mamie Till was only the first in a long procession of women who refused to bury their sons quietly. In her open coffin, others saw instruction. Decades later, Sabrina Fulton, Geneva Reed Veal, Gwen Carr, Leslie McSpadden, each would hold a press conference, not as victims, but as soldiers conscripted by grief. The pattern was always the same: a child taken, a lie written, a trial mocked by cameras, and a country pretending to debate what was already clear. When these mothers spoke, their words carried the same rhythm as Mamie's: controlled, deliberate, more powerful than shouting. "I don't hate," Sabrina once said, "but I won't stop." The lineage was unbroken, from a church in Chicago in 1955 to candlelight vigils in Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis. Different cities, same soil. Each mother's face reflected the one who came before her, all of them framed by microphones and disbelief. Their tears were broadcast, dissected, doubted, but never diminished. The phrase "say his name" was born from their endurance, a ritual of resistance stretching back to the boy in the river. Every time they stood before the world and demanded recognition, Emmett's shadow stood behind them, not haunting, but guarding. The movement had never been about one child, but about all who followed, each mother carrying a fragment of that impossible weight. Together, they turned mourning into momentum, sorrow into scripture. Photographs age, but some refuse to die. The picture of Emmett Till in his coffin still circulates, grainy, overexposed, yet unbearably alive. Teachers project it onto classroom walls, activists hold it high at marches, filmmakers frame it between scenes of modern protests. The image has traveled through decades of light, copied, scanned, reprinted, uploaded, pixelated, and resurrected, yet it never loses its force. It is both evidence and accusation. In every era, someone tries to censor it, calling it too graphic, too disturbing. But that's the point: it was meant to disturb. Mamie knew that when she said, "Let them see," the picture became a kind of relic, a secular icon for a country that refuses to canonize its martyrs honestly. Museums display it behind glass now, visitors whispering as if standing before something sacred. Children tilt their heads and ask, "Why would someone do that?" And no adult has a clean answer. In the soft hum of the exhibit halls, you can hear muffled sobs, footsteps slowing, a collective reckoning passing between strangers. The photograph doesn't just show a boy. It shows what happens when power mistakes itself for law. Each generation rediscovers it, recoils, and recognizes itself. The contrast of skin and bruise, of suit and coffin, of innocence and brutality, it remains a mirror. And even in pixels, it still holds a pulse. It asks nothing new, only that we keep looking. Because the moment we stop, the river begins again.
Every generation builds an archive and then flinches when it looks inside. Libraries, universities, and museums have spent decades cataloging the evidence: court documents, news clippings, the photographs, even the barbed wire from around the gin fan. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., Emmett Till's casket sits in a quiet, temperature-controlled room. Visitors file through whispering, some crying, some taking notes for research papers, others just standing still because standing still feels like prayer. The air hums with refrigeration and reverence. Yet the archive is not a coffin. It breathes. Historians argue over details. Curators debate how much to show. Each artifact demands an answer. Are we preserving horror or repeating it? One curator calls it ethical haunting, the duty to remember without consumption. In Mississippi, a younger generation of activists digitizes records, mapping the trial transcripts, uploading the FBI files, creating an online trail no one can erase. Truth has gone electric, impossible to bury again. Still, every few years, someone vandalizes the memorial signs, fires bullets into history's face, thinking silence can be reimposed. But the archive grows back stronger each time. It has learned resilience from the boy it guards. It has become the country's conscience on display, paper, steel, and light conspiring to say, "Look again. Don't look away."
In modern classrooms, his name lives in lesson plans, PowerPoint slides, and trembling student voices. Teachers dim the lights and project his photograph, then pause to let the silence work. Some students look away, some stare too long, and one always asks, why did they do it? The question lands heavy, older than anyone in the room. Teachers explain the facts, segregation, white supremacy, the lie that sparked it, but none of those words capture the heartbeat behind the horror. Sometimes a teacher's voice shakes, sometimes the projector hums like a low lament. Outside, the world still echoes the old story in new forms: a traffic stop, a camera phone, a courtroom. The students sense it even if they can't name it. In predominantly white schools, the air tightens, the room unsure whether to mourn or to listen. In black schools, the lesson feels like inheritance. One student, quiet until now, raises her hand. "My grandma marched for him," she says softly. The others turn toward her, and for a moment, history collapses, the boy in the river sitting among them, unseen but not unfelt. That's how the ghost works, not as a haunting, but as a reminder that education without empathy is just repetition. The bell rings, chairs scrape, and screens go dark, but the silence he leaves behind lingers longer than the lesson. The next day, they'll move to another chapter, but every child who saw his face will carry a piece of the river with them. The story found new life in the flicker of pixels, the hum of speakers, the streaming glow of modern confession. Documentary filmmakers, directors, and digital storytellers revived Emmett Till's case for generations who scroll instead of read, swipe instead of turn pages. In 2022, the film Till brought Mamie's voice back to theaters, her grief rendered in high definition, her defiance restored to center frame. Audiences watched the scene of the open casket and fell silent. Some cried, some couldn't move, some whispered that really happened, as if disbelief could unmake fact. Online, the hashtags rose again, #EmmettTill, #JusticeForTill, #NeverForget, crossing timelines, stitched into videos, layered over protest footage from modern streets that looked too much like old ones. The story became both memorial and mirror, shared millions of times in loops that blur past and present. In digital space, the river doesn't sleep, it streams. Yet with every upload, the risk grows, familiarity dulls shock, tragedy becomes content. Some creators chase clicks, but others, quieter, use the screen like scripture, pairing images of the past with faces of the present. Each frame insists, this is still happening. The medium changed, but the message did not. In every platform's glow, his mother's voice still cuts through, "Let them see." And in that command, the boy remains unburied, alive in data, light, and memory, refusing to fade no matter how many times is rendered or replayed.
Every few years, the headlines claim it's over. Another investigation closed, another official statement, another promise that the case has finally found peace. But peace is a word the dead don't recognize. Closure is a luxury for those who watched, not those who were watched. The FBI's final report, released decades after the murder, concluded that no living suspect could be prosecuted. Case closed, it read, as if justice could expire. For Mamie's descendants, and for millions who've whispered Emmett's name in prayers and protests, closure has always felt like betrayal. The river didn't close. The photograph didn't close. The bullet holes in the memorial signs didn't close. Each reopening of the case brings hope, but it also reopens the wound, and the country bleeds a little memory each time. Historians write that the murder catalyzed the civil rights movement, as if the horror could be repackaged as progress. But Emmett Till was not a symbol to his mother. He was her only son. The myth of closure comforts those who fear accountability. It lets them file away pain in labeled boxes. Yet history resists organization. It spills. It stains. In classrooms, museums, and headlines, people still reach for a period where there's only a comma. The story doesn't end, It lingers, waiting for a country brave enough to finish its own sentence. Until then, the file folders and documentaries and hashtags keep whispering the same unfinished word. Remember.
Before 1955, America's sound was one of distance. Church bells, factory whistles, and newsmen's polished tones smoothing over cruelty. After Emmett Till, the pitch changed. You could hear it in the speeches, the songs, the way protesters' chants broke rhythm into something raw. His name carried syncopation, a call and response echoing from Mississippi to Chicago, from pulpits to picket lines. The cadence of the civil rights era, King's deliberate pauses, the thunder of gospel choirs, the solemn gravity in Baldwin's voice, all trace their rhythm back to that river, that whistle, that open coffin. Even today, his story hums beneath the static of America's soundtrack, a pulse inside hip-hop verses, a whisper beneath film scores, a silence before a verdict is read on television. When Nina Simone sang Mississippi Goddamn, it wasn't just outrage, it was requiem. When modern artists rap about injustice, that same current moves through their breath, the same defiance Mamie taught the world. Look, listen, do not turn away. The boy who once whistled in a store now shapes the music of protest itself. A note of warning, a note of mourning. He didn't live to hear it, but every rhythm that confronts power carries his tempo. America learned to speak differently after him, to sing, to shout, to testify. And in every voice that breaks, somewhere deep in the undertone, you can still hear it, the faint rush of water against the roots of a cottonwood tree. In the end, the courtroom in Sumner was only a stage. The real trial began the moment the photographs hit print. Each viewer became a juror, each gaze a verdict. Some turned the page and found the boy guilty of his own death. Others stared and felt the scaffolding of their silence collapse. It was not the 12 white men who decided what Emmett Till's murder meant. It was the millions who saw his face and had to live with the knowledge. For nearly 70 years, America has been deliberating in slow motion. Every protest, every policy debate, every headline is part of the same trial. The evidence never stopped accumulating. Police reports, mugshots, footage of other sons. Each new case reopens the old one. The same witnesses appear, mothers, ministers, neighbors, testifying again and again, their words echoing like oaths that justice still hasn't kept. The country remains divided not by ignorance, but by verdict, guilty or not, complicit or awake. And every generation must take the stand. The jurors who acquitted Bryant and Milam are long gone, but their decision still stains the flag they swore to defend. History's gavel has yet to fall. Some think it already has, mistaking exhaustion for closure, fatigue for progress. But the court of conscience doesn't recess. It waits, endless, patient, collecting testimony in the form of art, protest, and remembrance. And when it finally calls roll, no one will be excused for absence.
30. The boy and the nation. The boy became the mirror, and the mirror became the measure of a nation's soul. 4 decades, America has tried to step around him, to turn the page, to sand the edges of his story until it felt less like accusation and more like history. But Emmett Till will not flatten into the past. His mother saw to that when she opened the coffin and forced the world to stare into its own reflection. Every generation since has met his gaze and been found wanting. Lawmakers signed bills in his name, monuments rose in the Delta heat, and scholars wrote volumes that all reached the same quiet sentence. The river still runs, and the wound still breathes. He is 14 forever, caught between laughter and legend, between what he was and what he became. The men who murdered him are dust now, their bones indistinguishable from the soil that once hid his blood. But the stain remains, mapped into the nation's DNA. Each time another mother pleads for justice, the courtroom reopens. Each time a child learns his name, the evidence is read aloud again. And still the verdict has not changed, because the trial was never theirs to lose or win. It belongs to the country that let it happen. The boy's killers were never truly on trial. The country was.